by the stakes that can decompose and allow the shed to settle. The building pad does not need to be perfectly level because the gravel will make it level once it is spread out. Now you are ready to install the gravel foundation bed. Fill the area with 3 to 4 inches of gravel and rake the gravel until it looks level visually. Then take a straight board and put a level on top of it and check the gravel bed for level. Use the board to move the gravel and make it level. Continue adjusting the gravel until the gravel bed is level in both directions. Now you are ready to frame the shed floor. The floor framing and foundation system shown here is designed to use pressure-treated lumber that is rated for contact with the ground. View our other floor framing videos to learn how to build the floor on foundation rails. Prepare the rim joist boards for the layout marks by cutting the 2 boards to the length shown on the plans and then standing them on edge next to each other. Make sure that the crowned edge is on the top sides and that the ends of the boards are flush with each other. Now you are ready to mark layout marks on the 2 boards. We will be marking the floor joist locations at 16 inches on center. Hook your tape measure on the ends of the 2 boards. Pull the tape measure down the boards and put a mark at 3/4 of an inch before or after the 16-inch point. Then put an X on the side of the mark closest to the 16-inch measurement on the tape to help you remember what side of the mark the floor joist will go on. Continue making marks at multiples of 16 inches along the edges of the boards. The reason you mark 3/4 of an inch away from the 16-inch marks is because the floor joist boards that you will be installing on the marks are 1.5 inches wide. If the center of the board is to be at 16 inches on center, then the edge will need to be 3/4 of an inch before or after the 16-inch point. Having the marks on the rim boards show the edges of the floor joists is the easiest way to mark and install the framing on a 16-inch layout. Thus, the marks are at 3/4 of an inch off the 16-inch mark, the 32-inch mark, the 48-inch mark, and so on. Once all the layout marks are made, you will transfer the marks to the other board and make a line across both boards using a speed square. Make sure that both boards have an X to show the side of the mark that the joist will go on. The next step in building the floor joist system is to prepare the rim joists and floor joists to be assembled together. Start by separating the rim joists and setting them on the gravel bed. Make sure that the rim joist layout marks are facing up and that the layout marks start on the same end of the shed. If you are hand driving the nails, it makes it easier to start the nails first and then move along the rim board and nail them on. Crown each of the floor joists and set them down in the gravel bed and align them with the layout marks you made earlier on the rim joists. Now, nail the rim boards to each of the floor joists. For 2x6 floor joists, you will use 3 nails at each connection. You should use galvanized nails with pressure-treated wood. Make sure that each floor joist end is aligned with its respective layout mark before nailing. Install both rim boards before moving on to the next step. Once the rim boards and floor joists are nailed together, you are ready to install the floor sheeting. Start by putting construction adhesive on the tops of all the joists that the sheet will be installed on. If your shed floor is larger than 1 sheet of sheeting, you may want to click on this link to view our other floor sheeting video. Use a caulking gun and tube of construction adhesive to put down a 1/4 inch bead along the tops of the joists and rim boards where the piece of floor sheeting will sit. Now, set the floor sheeting on top of the glue and nail it on. Try to set the sheet as close to its install location as possible so that the glue is not smeared from dragging the sheet around. Align one edge of the sheeting with the joists below. When the 2 corners are flush with the corners of the floor framing, you will nail those two corners onto the joists using 8D galvanized nails. Now, go to the other edges of the floor sheeting and align them with the joists below. Once they are flush on all edges, the floor framing will be square and you are ready to nail them together. By installing a third nail on one of the corners opposite the first two nails, you will lock the floor framing in place. You can install a nail on the fourth corner before laying out the other nail locations in the center of the sheet. To install the nails in the center of the sheet and be sure that they hit the floor joists, you will measure and mark the center of the joist locations using a tape measure, pencil, and chalk line. Hook the tape measure on the same end of the floor that you laid the joists out from, and place a mark at 16 inches on center to show the center of the floor joists. Repeat this on the other edge of the floor sheeting. Use a chalk line to make a mark between the corresponding joist centerline marks. Now you are ready to install the remaining nails to attach the floor sheeting to the floor joists. Install a nail at 6 inches on center along the edges and 12 inches on center in the field. With the floor sheeting installed, you are now ready to build the shed walls. Video. Here you will learn about the steps to laying out and building shed walls. This video shows you the necessary steps to building the shed walls, from laying out the plates to framing the door openings and assembling the walls. The materials used in wall framing are the wall plates and wall studs. The plates are the horizontal boards that run along the tops and bottom of the wall. The plates hold the studs at 16 inches or 24 inches on center. The wall studs are the vertical boards that are installed between the top and bottom plates. Together, they form the skeleton of the wall. The first step is to mark the wall locations on the shed floor. Start by sweeping the shed floor and then measuring in 3 1/2 inches from the edges of the shed floor and placing a mark. Do this on each side of all 4 corners of the shed floor. Verify that the distance between the 2 inner marks is 7 inches narrower than the overall width of the shed. And then use a chalk line to mark the inner edge of the shed walls on all 4 sides of the shed floor. The second step is to use the dimensions from the plans to mark and cut the wall plates to length. Only cut 2 plates for each wall at this time. You will cut the double top plate after framing and standing the walls. Set the wall plates in their final locations on the shed floor and then line them up with their respective wall marks on the floor and make sure that the ends of the boards are flush with each other. Also make sure that the corners meet the adjoining walls and are lined up with the wall marks. The third step is to install layout marks on the wall plates to mark the wall stud and doorway locations. Start by rolling each set of wall plates on their edges and make sure that the crown edge is facing up. Flush up the ends of the boards and make sure that each set of boards are snug up against each other. Now you are ready to put layout marks on the wall plates. Hook your tape measure on the ends of the 2 plates and pull the tape measure along the top edges. Put the first mark at 16 3/4 inches. Then put an X on the side of the mark closest to the tape measure hook end to help you remember what side of the mark the wall stud will go on. Continue making marks every 16 inches along the edges of the boards. Remember to mark 3/4 of an inch past the multiple of 16 to show where the edge of the wall stud will be. Once all the layout marks are made, you will transfer the marks to the other board and make a line across both boards using the framing or speed square. Make sure that both boards have an X to show the side of the mark that the stud will go on. The door opening will be marked on the wall plates that the doorway is on. Measure and mark the doorway trimmer and king stud locations on both plates. The king stud goes from the bottom plate to the top plate on both sides of the door header. You should mark its location with a K instead of an X so that you remember what it is when you are nailing on wall studs. The The trimmer stud goes on the inside of the door opening to hold up the door or window header. Mark the trimmer locations with a T. If there are any window openings, you will mark them in the same way. The fourth step is to make sure the wall studs are the proper length, and then assemble the wall plates and wall studs by nailing them together. You will build one wall at a time, so set the plates for the first wall you will build on your work surface, and separate the top and bottom plates far enough apart so that the wall studs will fit in between them. Make sure to keep the crown side with the layout marks facing up. Also, keep the ends that the layout starts on the same end. Set the wall studs on the work surface between the wall plates, with one stud next to each layout mark. Crown each wall stud and set it close to its respective layout mark on the wall plates. You are now ready to nail the wall plates to the studs. Align the end of the wall stud with the layout marks you made on the wall plates, and nail the wall plates to the wall studs. Use 2 nails at each connection for 2x4 walls. Make sure to nail the wall studs on the X side of the layout marks. Continue nailing until all the wall studs are attached to the plates. The fifth step is to build a header for the doorway opening. The header for the doorway is made by sandwiching a piece of OSB between 2 header boards and nailing them together. Window headers are built and installed exactly the same as door headers. Start by cutting 2 header boards to the length shown on the plans. Then cut a piece of OSB or plywood to sandwich between the 2 header boards. It should be a bit smaller than the header boards so it does not stick out around the edges. Crown the 2 header boards and then set the piece of OSB between them. Align the edges of the header boards flush with each other and then nail them to each other using 12D nails. The sixth step is to assemble the wall with the doorway in it. Mark the height of the door header from the shed floor on the king studs so your door will fit properly, and then nail the king studs to the header boards. Now nail the king studs and header assembly to both the top and bottom plates on the respective king stud marks. After the wall is framed, you will install the trimmer boards. Measure the distance from the bottom of the header to the top of the bottom plate and cut a trimmer board for each side of the doorway. Crown and install the trimmers by nailing the bottom plates to them and nailing them to the king studs. Make sure to nail from the inside of the doorway, so if the nails protrude, they will stick out on the inside of the wall and not into the doorway. Now you can finish building the rest of the wall as you did the other walls. If there is an open space between the door header and the top plate, you can install the cripple studs above the header at this time. Window openings are framed exactly like a door opening, with the addition of a window sill and cripples to hold it up. For a more detailed explanation of framing a window opening, please click on this video link. Assemble the header for the window in the same way you did for the door opening, and then build the king stud and header assembly. Attach them to the top and bottom plates on the king stud layout marks. Measure, cut, and install trimmers to hold the header up. To install the windowsill, you will measure down from the bottom of the header and mark the window rough opening on the trimmers. Cut a sill board and nail it on the proper side of the marks on the trimmer boards. Now, measure, cut, and install trimmers to hold the windowsill up. Now you can finish building the rest of the wall as you did the other walls. The seventh step is to stand the shed walls. Start by clearing everything off the shed floor and sweeping it clean. Stand one of the long walls first. Align the wall with the wall line marks and the edge of the shed floor. Attach the wall to the floor by nailing the bottom plate of the wall to the floor with two 12D nails every 16 inches. Try to install the nails so that they go through the bottom plate and the flooring into the floor joists below. You can see where the floor joists are by looking for the nail heads on the floor. Stand and nail the remaining walls in the same way. As you stand each wall and nail it to the floor, flush up the corner boards of the two walls and nail the two walls together at the corner. Use one 12D nail at 12 inches on center vertically. The final step to building the walls is to install the double top plates. Adding a second top plate further locks the walls together and strengthens the top of the wall to better hold the roof. Install the double top plate on the shorter framed walls first. Install nails on both sides of the wall-to-wall connection to tie the walls together. Continue nailing along the top plates by using two 12D nails at 16 inches on center. Finally, install the double top plates on the longer walls between the first not rust. The first step to installing the siding is to determine how tall the sheets need to be. You will want the top of the sheets to start at 1/2 inch below the top of the wall. The bottom edges of the sheet should extend at least 1 1/2 inches below the bottom plate of the wall framing. On the lean-to shed, long, and cut it off after the roof framing is installed. Mark the line where the bottom edge of the siding will be and install at least two 12D nails on the line under each sheet location to temporarily hold the sheets while you install them. The 1/2 inch reveal at the top keeps the siding out of the way of the rafter seat and bird's mouth. The bottom overlap keeps the water from running down the shed wall and onto the shed floor. The second step is to attach the first piece of siding. The first piece of siding on each of the walls is the most important because it makes the wall square and locks the wall in place. Start by making sure that the sheet is oriented so the edge overlaps of each successive sheet will be on top of the previous sheet. Set the sheet on the temporary nails. Move the siding board until the edge of the siding is flush with the corner of the shed and install one nail to attach the lower corner edge of the sheet to the corner wall framing board. Push or pull the wall until the edge of the siding is flush with the corner and install a second nail to attach the upper edge of the sheet to the corner wall framing board. The third nail will lock the wall in a square position as long as the edges of the siding are parallel to the respective wall studs behind the siding. Before installing the third nail, you must move the wall top plates back and forth until the top edge of the siding is parallel to the top plates and the unattached vertical edge is parallel to the wall stud it overlaps. After the siding is attached in 3 points, you can install the remaining nails around the edges at 6 inches on center. If you are siding a longer wall, you do not need to nail the edge that the second sheet will overlap, because you will nail on top of the overlap when the second sheet is installed. Use a tape measure to locate the boards behind the center of the sheet and mark their locations so you can install nails without missing the boards. Install the nails on the center of the sheet at 12 inches on center. The third step is to install the remaining sheets. On longer walls, you will square the wall with the first sheet as described in step 2, and then install the second sheet so that it overlaps the first sheet on the wall stud that both sheets share. The second sheet is installed similar to the first sheet, but you will not need to square the wall because it will no longer move laterally. This wall has a window opening. If you are installing a window opening, do not try to nail around the edges of the opening. The nail heads may interfere with the cutting of the siding material. We will show you how to cut out the window opening in the last step. Continue installing siding sheets around the shed. Make sure that you start and align each new wall corner like you did the first corner. The upper edges of the siding will need to be trimmed to 1/2 inch below the top plates on the tall and short walls. The siding on the sloping walls of the shed will be cut after the roof is framed. The fourth step is to install siding around the door opening. The home-built door openings on our sheds are designed with a 1-inch reveal to allow the door to overlap the opening. If you are installing a pre-hung door, you will install the siding to the edge of the door opening. To install the siding to fit a home-built door with a 3/4 inch overlap, measure away from the door opening 1 inch and place a mark around the opening. Double check that the distance between the marks on the left and right sides match the dimensions on the door plans. Cut and install the siding around the door. Make sure that the wall is square using the same 3-nail technique used to attach the first sheets on the other walls. To finish the door opening, you will use a hand saw or reciprocating saw to remove the wall bottom plate in the opening. To cut the siding away from a window opening, you will install the siding on one side of the opening and then use a tape measure and measure from the back edge of the siding to the rough frame sides of the window opening. Transfer the measurements to the outside face of the siding. Then use the measurement marks to make cut lines on the face of the siding. If enough of the header and sill are visible, you can align a straight edge with them on the visible side of the window and overlap the straight edge on the face of the siding on the part of the window that is covered. Then mark along the straight edge to show the location of the window opening. When you are done, you should have a drawing of the window opening on the face of the siding. Set a circular saw to the depth of the siding thickness and cut along the window opening cut lines. It helps to cut on the outside of the lines to be sure that you remove any siding that might overlap into the window opening. After the siding is cut away from the window opening, you will install nails around the opening. Now you are ready to install the siding sheet on the other side of the window opening. After the siding is installed, you will repeat the process to remove the siding material on the second half of the window opening. If the siding covers the whole window, a rafter is the support member that holds up the roof sheeting and roofing materials. To make the lean-to shed rafter ends vertical when installed, both ends of the rafter will need to be cut to the angle of the roof slope. The roof on this shed is a 4 and 12 slope, which makes it an 18 and 1/2 degree angle on the board ends. A rafter or speed square will have the mark for this angle. Start by marking the eave end of the rafter with the roof slope angle. If you are using a speed square, place the pivot point of the square on the bottom edge of the rafter and pivot the square until the 4 on the common angle markings lines up with the same bottom edge of the rafter. Mark this angle. After the mark is made, cut the board along the angle mark. Now measure from the long point of the cut you just made along the bottom edge of the rafter and mark the short point of the ridge cut on the other end of the rafter. The rafter dimensions are on the lean-to shed plans. Mark a square line across the board at the short point of the ridge cut. Set the square on the top edge of the rafter. Pivot the square so the proper roof angle shows, and then line up the edge of the square where the mark you just made meets the bottom edge of the rafter. Mark the board along this angle. You will notice that the second cut angle is parallel with the first cut on the other end of the rafter. Use a saw to cut along this line. Make sure to cut on the waist side of the line so the rafter size will be as accurate as possible. If you have a chop saw, you can set the angle of your ridge cut on the saw and make the cuts without using the angle from the framing or speed square. The next step will be to mark and cut out the bird's mouth and horizontal seat. The vertical cut is called the bird's mouth and the horizontal cut is called the seat. Refer to your plans to find the dimensions for the roof angle you are cutting. Measure from the long point on the eave end of the rafter to the start of the vertical bird's mouth and place a mark. Then measure further down the board to mark the end of the horizontal seat mark. Use the square to place marks all the way across the board on the 2 points you just made. To mark the bird's mouth angle, place the pivot point of the square where the bird's mouth mark meets the bottom edge of the rafter. Pivot the square until the 4 on the common marks lines up with the edge of the rafter. Mark the rafter with this angle. With the square still on the bird's mouth mark, measure up the line you just made and place a mark showing the depth of the bird's mouth according to your rafter plans. On a 4 and 12 pitch roof, the dimension is 1 and 11/32. To mark the seat cut, you will flip the square over and place the pivot point where the seat mark meets the edge of the board. Mark a line from that point to the bird's mouth depth line. Set your circular saw to its deepest cut setting and cut along the bird's mouth and seat lines. Make sure to cut on the waist side of the lines and cut only to where the lines intersect. To fully remove the piece of wood, you will need to flip the rafter over and continue the cuts to their intersection point. The piece of wood should be easily removable at this point, but there will still be a bit of wood in the corner that will need to be taken out. Use a wood chisel and hammer to remove the remaining wood. The next step is to measure, mark, and cut the upper rafter seat and bird's mouth. Using the dimensions from the rafter plans, measure and mark the dimension between where the eave end seat mark meets the edge of the rafter to where the ridge end bird's mouth meets the edge of the rafter, and make a mark. Use a square to make this mark all the way across the rafter. Then measure further down the rafter to locate and mark the end of the horizontal seat mark. Repeat the steps you performed earlier by placing the pivot point of the square where the bird's mouth mark meets the bottom edge of the rafter. Pivot the square until the 4 on the common marks lines up with the bottom edge of the rafter and mark the rafter with this angle. With the square still on the bird's mouth mark, measure up the line you just made and place a mark showing the depth of the bird's mouth according to your rafter plans. To mark the seat cut, you will flip the square over and place the pivot point where the seat mark meets the bottom edge of the rafter. Mark a line from that point to the bird's mouth depth line. Cut along the seat and bird's mouth lines to remove the piece of wood like you did previously. Test fit the rafter on the shed walls by setting it on top of the top plates of the wall. If it fits well, you can use the first rafter as a template to trace and make the other rafters. If it does not fit properly, you will need to figure out what is off, correct the problem, and then make a new rafter. The first rafter will be used as a template to aid in marking the remaining rafters. This ensures that they are as close to the same size as possible. To use your first rafter as a template, you will lay it on a new rafter board and trace the cut marks onto the new rafter board. Then cut out the rafter along the cut lines. Stack all the rafters on top of each other to double check that they are all the same before installing them. Continue learning about shed building by clicking on one of these videos. Welcome to this lean-to shed roof building video. Here you will learn about the steps to building a shed roof, including installing roof rafters, fascia boards, and roof sheeting. The first step to installing the roof rafters is to mark the rafter locations on the top plates. Start the layout on the plans. Mark the rafter locations at 24 inches on center. Hook your tape measure on the end of the top plates and pull the tape measure along the top edges. Put the first mark at 24 3/4 inches. Then put an X on the side of the mark closest to the tape measure hook end to help you remember what side of the mark the rafter will go on. Continue making marks every 24 inches along the edges of the boards. Remember to mark 3/4 inch past the multiple of 24 to show where the edge of the roof rafters will be. Lay out the second set of wall plates, making sure to start at the same end of the shed as you laid out the first wall. After the rafter locations are determined, you will use a square to mark all the way across the top plates. The second step is to attach the rafters to the top plates. Before nailing the rafters on, you should double check that the walls are the same distance from each other along the full length of the walls and adjust them if necessary. Set a rafter on the top plates and align it on the proper side of the layout mark. Snug the eave end bird's mouth of the rafter up to the siding and then use 3/8 to top plate connection to nail it to the top plate. Move to the second wall and align the other end of the rafter with its respective mark and attach it to the wall plate. Continue installing the rest of the rafters in the same way. Make sure that the overhang of the rafter bird's mouth is the same on all rafters. The third step is to install the subfascia. The subfascia is the 2x4 or 2x6 boards that connect the ends of the roof rafters. Start by cutting the fascia boards to length. If you have long rafter tails, you should mark the rafter layout on the fascia boards at 24 inches on center and align the marks on the fascia board with the rafter tails. For shorter rafter tails, you will start by aligning the end of the fascia board with the first rafter. Make sure that the top of the fascia board is flush with the top of the rafters by holding a straight edge on the top of the rafter and moving the fascia up until it touches it. Then nail the fascia board onto the rafter tails using two 12D nails at each connection. Install the second fascia board on the other side of the shed, just like you did the first side. You are now ready to install the roof sheeting. We mistakenly removed the siding before the roof sheeting was installed. You should leave the siding running long until the roof sheeting is installed to allow the siding to run flush with the top of the roof sheeting. The first sheeting piece is installed from the same end you laid the trusses out from. Set the sheeting on the rafters with the lower edge flush with the fascia and the end flush with the face of the rafter. If your shed is longer than 8 feet, make sure that the end that shares a rafter with the next sheet is splitting the top edge of the rafter. Nail the sheeting to the fascia and end rafter. You can use a few nails at first to hold the sheet in place, and then come back later and nail off the whole roof at one time. The fifth step is to mark the rafter location on the top edge of the sheet and attach the sheeting to the rafters. Hook the tape measure on the edge of the roof sheeting on the end of the shed and mark the 24-inch on-center layout across the top edge of the sheeting piece. Move each rafter to line it up with the layout marks and nail the sheeting to the rafter. This will lock the rafters in place so they remain on layout as you continue installing sheeting on the roof. On larger sheds, when two pieces of sheeting meet on a rafter, each sheet will sit on half of the top edge of the rafter. Once you have adjusted the rafter to evenly hold each piece of sheeting, you will nail the sheeting on. Before installing more sheeting and covering up the rafters, use a chalk line to mark the center line locations of the rafters on top of the roof sheeting so you can accurately nail the sheeting to the rafters. The sixth step is to install the remaining rows of sheeting. The sheets in each row should be staggered from the previous row. They are typically installed with a 4-foot offset. This increases the strength of the roof system. This roof is only 8 feet long, so the sheets do not need to be staggered. The roof sheeting needs to have a 1/8 inch gap between the edges to give it room for expansion. Use several 8D nails in the joint between the sheets to hold the gap open while you are nailing the sheet to the rafters. Nail the sheet to the rafters and then remove the nails used to hold the gap open between the sheets. The 7th step is to install the nails on the edges and center of the roof sheets. If you have not already done so, you will need to install nails every 6 inches along the edges and every 12 inches in the center of the sheets. The final steps are to remove the siding overlapping on the gable ends and to install spacer pieces of the siding on the gable rafter tails. Use a chalk line to transfer the angled line of the top of the sheeting to the outer face of the gable siding. Then use a circular saw set to the depth of your siding thickness and cut the siding off above the top of the roof sheeting level. The last item to be installed before the trim is installed on the roof is OSB trim material that has a wood pattern on the face. The first step to installing trim on the shed is to install the fascia on the eaves and gable ends of the shed roof. The eave fascia is first because the rake fascia on the gables will overlap it on the ends. Start by measuring the eaves and cutting the fascia to length. Make sure that the top edge is flush with the top of the roof sheeting and that the ends are flush with the siding, and then nail the fascia trim boards to the subfascia. Install the eave fascia on both eaves of the shed using 8D galvanized nails. The second step is to install the rake fascia. Use a trim board that is a bit longer than necessary to cover the peak to eave distance and mark the roof pitch angle using a framing or speed square on one end. Start by marking a square line across the board. Keep the pivot point of the speed square on the end of the line and pivot it until the edge of the board lines up with the roof pitch mark on the common scale. Mark the angle on the board and then cut it. If you have a miter saw, you can set the angle on the saw and cut the angle onto the board without marking it first. Hold the fascia board in its position and verify that the angle is correct. The ridge end of the trim board should be vertical when the top edge of the trim is flush with the shed roof. With the fascia board lined up with the ridge position and flush with the roof deck, use a pencil to mark the cutoff point on the long end of the board by tracing along the face of the eave fascia onto the back side of the rake fascia board. This will be your cut mark for the fascia. Cut the rake fascia board and double check the length. Nail the rake fascia on, making sure that the nails go into the roof rafter behind the fascia. Repeat the process and install the fascia on the opposite end of the shed in the same way. The third step is to install the soffit on the eaves of the shed roof. If your shed does not have a covered soffit, then you can skip this step. The soffit goes on before the corner trim, so that the corner trim can butt up against it. Use a tape measure to measure the length and width of the soffit. The ends of the soffit board that are on the ends of the shed will butt up against the fascia board. The long edges should touch the shed wall and the backside of the fascia. Mark the rafter locations on the shed walls so you will know where to place the nails when the soffit covers the rafters and you can no longer see them. Put the soffit boards into position and nail the soffit boards to the bottom of the roof rafters. Use one 8D nail at each rafter. Install the soffit on the other side of the shed. The fourth step is to install the corner trim. When installing corner trim, you will want the trim on the front of the shed to cover the edge of the corner trim piece on the side of the shed. This means that you will install the trim on the sides of the shed first and then on the front. To install the gable end of the shed corner trim, you will first cut the roof angle onto a piece of trim that is about 2 to 4 inches longer than needed to cover the corner. Hold the piece of trim on the corner of the shed where it will be installed, and then hold a scrap piece of trim on the other side of the corner to help you properly position the full-size piece that will be nailed on. Check the top angle for a good fit and adjust as necessary. Mark the length to match the siding and cut it. Make sure that the edges are flush with each other and the corner gap is closed, and then nail the trim onto the shed. Use one 8D nail every 12 inches along the piece of trim and 2 inches from the ends. Make sure to note where the wall stud is behind the trim before nailing. To install the front piece of corner trim, you will measure the length of the trim, cut it to length, and then nail it to the corner. Make sure that the corner is flush with the outside edge of the first piece of trim installed. Hold the trim piece in place and mark where it will need to be notched out to fit around the gable end rake trim, and cut it out. Install the piece of trim and then install the other 4 corners in the same way. The 5th step is to install the trim around the door opening. The door trim is installed flush with the edge of the siding that is held 1 inch back from the door opening framing. The header trim piece is installed first. It should overlap the 2 side casing trims. Measure and cut the header trim according to your trim design. Before nailing the header trim on, you will first make sure that it has the proper spacing on each side of the door by holding a scrap piece of trim up on the sides of the door and adjusting the header trim until the 2 sides are equal. The casing trims are installed after the header trim piece. Measure from the bottom of the header trim to the bottom of the siding to find the lengths for the casing trims on the 2 sides of the door opening. Continue learning about shed building. Welcome to this asphalt shingle installation video. Here you will learn about the steps to installing asphalt shingles on your lean-to storage shed. The first step to installing asphalt shingles is to install the drip edge on the eave edge of the roof. Cut the 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch metal drip edge using tin snips. Make a corner in each of the shed roof end pieces and extend the drip edge up the rake of the roof 2 inches. The drip edge is set directly on top of the roof sheeting and fascia trim. It goes under the building paper to allow any moisture running down on top of the paper to be on top of the drip edge. Nail the drip edge to the roof deck using 1 nail every 24 inches. The second step is to install building paper over the eave drip edge and roof deck. Building paper can be very slippery, so great care must be taken when standing on it. Roofing paper nails with plastic caps work best to hold the paper without ripping it. Make sure to only stand on places that are well nailed on, and also try to always stand on a plastic nail head. Line the building paper up with the drip edge and install 1 nail near the corner end. It can overhang the rake and be cut off squarely later. Roll the paper out along the drip edge. Align it with the drip edge and install a second nail to hold it in place. Go back and install nails every 12 inches along the edges and 24 inches in the center. The top edge does not need to be nailed because it will be nailed on with the next overlapping row. Install each successive row, making sure to overlap the previous row by 4 inches minimum. The third step is to install the drip edge along the rakes of the roof. The rake drip edge is installed on top of the building paper so that any moisture will be diverted above the paper. Cut the building paper off flush with the fascia board before installing the drip edge. Start at the lower end of the rake and overlap the 2-inch return from the eave drip edge that was installed earlier. Cut the drip edge to terminate at the ridge, and nail the drip edge on in the same way as before, using a roofing nail at each end and every 24 inches along the top. The fourth step is to make horizontal alignment marks on the building paper to help you keep the rows of asphalt shingles straight. Start by measuring up from the drip edge along the roof rakes and placing a mark every 12 inches. Use a chalk line to mark the lines across the roof between the marks, so you have horizontal lines that are parallel to the eaves. The fifth step is to install a row of starter strip shingles. The starter strips are used to help the first row of shingles that sit over the drip edge to stick to the roof without having nail heads showing. Starter strips can be purchased, or you can make them from the regular shingles you purchased to install the roof. Since most sheds only need a few starter pieces, it is typically more economical to cut the starter strips from shingles. To make starter strips from regular shingles, you will flip a shingle over and cut it lengthwise along the tar strip, just above the tops of the factory-made slits. Cut enough shingles to run along the eave of the shed. Cut 6 inches off the first starter strip so that the joints in the starter strip row are offset 6 inches from the row of shingles that will go directly on top of it. The first starter strip installed will be the one that you cut 6 inches off of. Install the starter strip with the tar strip on top of the drip edge. There should be a 3/8 inch overhang over both the eave and rake drip edges. Put a nail every 12 inches just above the tar strip and 1 inch from the ends. Continue installing starter strips along the eave drip edge. They should be 36 inches long and the ends are butted against each other. Cut the last starter strip off and leave a 3/8 inch overhang on the gable rake edge. The sixth step is to install the first 6 rows of shingles. Each row of shingles will be offset from the previous row by 6 inches. This prevents water from running down between the shingle joints and into the shed. Start at the same end of the eave that you started the starter strip on and install a full 36 inch long shingle over the starter strip. Maintain the same 3/8 inch overhang of the drip edge by lining the shingle up with the starter strip. Each shingle gets 4 nails, one on each end and one above each of the slits. Nails are typically installed 5/8 of an inch from the top of the slits and not in the tar strip. Continue installing the first row using full 36 inch shingles. Cut the end of the first row before moving to the second row, so you will have a reference point for the 3/8 inch overhang when you cut the next few rows of shingles that are installed. Start the second row with a 6 inch offset from the first row and using a full 36 inch long shingle. Continue installing rows of shingles, always starting with a 6 inch offset and letting the ends overhang the rake until you have 6 rows installed. As you install each new row, you will visually line it up with the horizontal marks you made on the building paper to keep the rows straight. After 6 rows have been installed, return to the starting ends of the shingles and install the filler pieces. Make sure that the pieces follow the same joint offset pattern as the shingles previously installed on the roof. These ends can also overhang the rake of the roof and be cut off later. This is a good place to use scrap ends from other parts of the roof, but on the first runs of roofing you will not have much scrap. The seventh step is to cut the shingle ends off after the first 6 rows are installed. You will use the straight edge of a spare shingle to line up your cut. Flip a shingle over and line the straight edge up with the 3/8 inch overhang of the lower shingle. On the top end, you will hold the straight edge 3/8 inch off the drip edge. Use your utility knife to cut along the straight edge of the shingle. It sometimes takes several passes with a knife to cut all the way through. Now, clean the edges of that piece of asphalt roofing to burnish the cut edge of the shingles that are installed on the roof. The 8th step is to continue installing shingles in 6-row sets. The 7th row of shingles will start with a full shingle on the gable rake, just like the 1st row installed. Continue following the same 6-row pattern that you did until the shingles reach the roof ridge. When you get to the ridge, you will cut off the overlapping shingle flush with the ridge fascia. The 9th step is to install the metal ridge cap drip edge to seal the top edge of the roof from water penetration. The metal is different from the regular drip edges in that it should overlap the roof shingles up by 3 inches minimum and preferably 4 inches. Check with your local roofing supplier to find a pre-made flashing that will work for your situation. Set the metal flush on one end and then mark and cut the other end flush with the roof edge. If your roof needs 2 pieces of metal, you will overlap the metal joint by 6 inches and use roofing mastic between the overlap joint. The flashing should sit snug up against the roof and fascia. You may need to bend it so the angles match. It can be bent using a homemade brand on the roof. Bending by hand may cause flashing. If you have any kinks in the flashing, you can pound them out using a hammer. Flip the metal upside down and install the roofing mastic on the edge that will rest on the shingles. Use 2 rows of mastic, one close to each edge. Make sure that the bead of mastic goes across the ends so the water is less likely to touch construction, which makes the door stronger to help it hang straight and give you years of service. You will be building 2 separate doors that are slightly in size. The main door overlaps the secondary door. The secondary door is held closed by bolt or spring latches inside the shed. Remember to always use exterior polymer-coated flathead screws for all attachments. We will build the secondary door first. After cutting out the back panels, internal wood rails, and front panels, the first step is to attach the back panel to the door rails. Start by setting the surface, following the layout pattern shown on the door plans. Set the back panel on the rails and make the outer edges of the rails flush with the edge of the panel. Screw the panel to the rails using a 1 5/8 inch screw at 12 inches on center. Panel to the rail and back panel assembly you just made. Flipping the door over and setting the front panel on it. Use a tape measure to measure and adjust the front panel until the overhang is 1 1/4 inches on the 3 sides that will be adjacent to the walls and floor. On the 4th side that is between the 2 doors, the front panel will be held back 1 1/4 inches to show the internal rail. This step takes several adjustments to make sure the overhangs and reveals are all equal. Attach the panel to the rails using 1 5/8 inch screws. Install 1 screw at each rail end and in the center. The trim screws will increase the attachment strength when the trim is installed. Remember that there is a 1 1/4 inch reveal, so the screws will need to be at least 1.5 inches from the panel edges. Be careful not to install them so far in from the edge that the trim boards will not cover them. The 3rd step is to build the main operable door. It is built similar to the secondary door, except that the front panel overhangs on all sides. This allows it to overlap the secondary door to create a more weather-tight fit and finish. Use the same screw sizes and placements that you did on the other door you made. The main door front panel overhangs are different from the secondary door that you built previously. The 3 sides that touch the shed walls and floor will have an overhang of 1 1/4 inches. The side that touches the secondary door will have an overhang of 1 1/2 inch. After the 2 doors are made, you should lay them next to each other and verify the overhangs and overall sizes. The 4th step is to attach the door trim pieces. Cut out the trim pieces and check that they will fit together on the front of the doors. Make sure that the screws are located so that they anchor into the door rails behind the siding. Use a screw at each end of each trim piece and then spaced evenly at 12 to 16 inches apart. Any trim pieces in the center will need to have their screws angled so that they hit the inner door rail. Install the trim on both doors. You can set the doors next to each other after the trim is installed and check how they look. After the doors are built, you are ready to complete the fifth step and install the doors on the shed. Door opening by setting a 1/2 inch thick piece of lumber on the door threshold the proper distance while you install the door hinges. The door opening, making sure that the inner door rail is resting on the 1/2 inch piece of lumber. Now adjust the reveals around the doors by moving the doors side to side until the reveals are equal. There should be a 1/4 inch reveal on all exterior edges of the doors. Once the reveals are equal, you can install the door hinges. Install 6-inch gate hinges using 3-inch exterior screws. Remember that the door rails are 1 1/4 inches from the door edges, so you must pull the screws that are not over the door rails so that they hit the door rails. The bolt of the hinges should be centered on the gap between the door and the shed trim. The bolt should also be aligned vertically with the gap. When the hinge bolts are not in line with the door, they cause the door to bind when it is opened. The top and bottom hinges should sit so that their edges just pass over the inside corner of the door trim. Ensure that the screws will hit the inner door rail. After the door hinges are installed, you can open the doors to test the fit. It may be tight to get it open because of the 1/2 inch board under the door rail. Once it falls out, the door should swing easily. The 6th step is to install the door bolt latches and locking hardware. Install them by closing the secondary door and holding the latches in their install location. Then, mark on the floor and door header where to drill the hole for the latch pins to go into the floor and door header. When installing your door latch, make sure to use the 2 1/2 inch exterior screws you used to build the shed doors. This helps better secure the latch to the shed. Continue learning about shed building by clicking on one of these. Welcome to this window installation video. Here you will learn the steps to installing a vinyl window on your storage shed. The first step is to prepare the window opening by installing flashing around the 3 lower sides of the window. Make sure that the flashing does not extend farther onto the wall than the width of the trim you will install around the window. Start at the bottom of the opening and extend the flashing past each side of the window opening by the width of the flashing. Install flashing to the sides of the window opening and extend flashing past the top and bottom of the opening by the width of the flashing. The second step is to apply a 3/8 inch bead of flexible sealant around the entire window opening. Make sure to get it close enough to the opening that the window flange will cover it. The third step is to set the window in the opening and center it. Make sure that the weep holes on the window are down and to the outside of the shed. Press the window into the seat to get a good continuous seal between the window and the shed wall. Center the window in the opening by sliding it to one side and marking the wall at the flange edge on the side you pushed it to. Then slide the window to the other side and make another mark on the side you pushed it to. Now, center the window between the 2 marks. The fourth step is to install one fastener through one of the holes on the nailing fin on the top right side of the frame, about 3 to 4 inches below the top corner. Make sure the fasteners are long enough to go 1 inch into the wall stud behind the siding or sheeting. Use a level to make sure that the window is sitting level and plumb in the opening. If you are installing a window that opens, you will need to check that it is square, so it will open properly. The window should have full support under the seal. After the window is level and install a second fastener through one of the holes in the nailing fin on the lower left corner of the window. Double check that the window is level and plumb and square and opens properly if it is an openable window. Continue installing fasteners through every other nailing hole around the window. The fasteners along the top nailing fin on the head of the window should be installed at the top of the holes and should not compress the fin, so if the header moves, it will not affect the window. The fifth step is to install the flashing across the head of the window. Overlap the nailing fin and extend it out to the sides to the width of the flashing. If your flashing is not self-adhering, you should seal the flashing to the nailing fin with flexible sealant. The top flashing goes over the outside of the window, so if water comes in contact with the flashing, it will stay on the outside of the window. Trim the top flashing so it does not stick out beyond the side flashing, and wood window trim. The sixth step is to install trim around the window. Start at the bottom of the window and install the sill first. Use galvanized fasteners to install all trim and siding on your shed. Install the side pieces of trim second and the top head piece of trim last. Make sure to leave about 1/8 of an inch between the trim and the window to allow for expansion between the window and trim materials. The seventh step is to fill the gap between the window and the trim with a flexible sealant. You will also install sealant between the trim and the shed wall. Continue learning about shed building by Welcome to this shed painting video. Here you will learn about the steps to painting your storage shed. The first step to painting the shed is to look at each surface for any nail heads that are sticking up and use a hammer to nail them flush with the surface. If there is sawdust on the surface of the shed, you will need to take a wet rag and wash the surfaces. If the screws used to build the doors have lifted the surface around the screw hole, you will need to scrape off the material that is higher than the trim surface to prepare it for caulking. The second step is to apply caulking over any blemishes in the siding and cracks. Nail heads can be left uncaulked as long as they do not break the surface of the siding. Any place the surface is broken, like where screws are used, you will need to caulk the area. Apply a dab of caulk to as many spots as you can without it drying before you finish. Then use a wet finger to push and make the surface of the caulking level with the surface of the wood without creating a concave surface. Now take a wet paintbrush and brush the surface of the caulking so that the caulking gets a brushed texture and the caulking on the wood surface blends with the wood pattern. Installing caulking on the corner joint between the trim and shed walls will create a nice finish to your paint job. Caulked corners are much easier to paint a straight line on. When painting the trim, place the tip of the caulking tube on the corner joint and apply caulking to the corner while moving the caulking tip along the corner joint. The trick to applying caulking is to apply the minimal amount of caulk needed to fill the joint. Try to keep moving along the corner joint at the same rate of speed so the bead of caulk is even. Now take a wet rag and use it to get your finger wet and run your finger along the corner joint to press the caulking into the joint and smooth the edges on the trim. You need to periodically clean your finger on the wet rag and refresh the wetness of your fingertip. The third step is to prime the trim on the shed. Primer is designed to help the paint bind to the wood surface. It also seals the wood surface so that the paint will go on and dry evenly, which allows the finished paint coat to cure properly. We used a pre-primed trim on this shed, so we installed 2 coats of paint over the trim. The primer for the main body of the shed is tinted the same color as the paint for the main body on the shed, so we installed it after 2 coats of paint were on the trim. The 4th step is to paint the trim. When painting, you should always start high and work down. This allows gravity that pulls the paint drips down to help you instead of work against you. Try to work on one wall at a time and paint all the trim on one wall before moving to the next. This reduces the times you need to move your equipment and materials. Start at the roof eaves and apply paint to the trim and soffit. Use long strokes when brushing and work from one end of the piece of trim to the other so that you are always installing the wet paint edge. After the fascia, you can move down to the corner trim. Start at the top and work your way down. The paint should fully cover the trim and slightly go onto the trim on this corner to show you how it is done, but we will be painting the corners the same color as the body. The door trim is painted in the same manner as the corner trim. You will need to tape off the hinges so that they do not get paint on them. Apply tape to the hinge surfaces and then use a utility knife to cut off any pieces of tape that you will typically need to apply 2 coats of trim paint to make sure that you have even coverage in your paint. To verify how soon after the first coat of paint is applied that you can apply a second coat. Remember that factors like air temperature, humidity, and wind will change the speed at which your paint will dry. The 5th step is to cut in the main color around the trim. This creates a clean line between the trim paint and the main body paint. Install painter's tape on the trim side of the corner joint. Use long pieces of tape to make sure that you get a straight line. Stick one end of the tape to the trim with the edge in the corner joint and pull a few feet of tape out and align it with the joint and press it into the joint. Use a 2-inch angled brush to cut in around the trim. Once again, work from the top down to keep ahead of any drips. After getting a good line along the corner between the trim and the wall, you will paint a 2-inch wide strip on the shed wall. Cut in all the trim to shed wall connections before moving on to paint the shed walls. The 6th step is to use a paint roller to prime the body of the shed. You can have the paint store tint the primer to the same color as your paint, so it will be easier to cover. When using a roller, you will work from one end of the shed wall to the other. Load the roller with paint and then roll the paint on in full lines from the top of the wall to the bottom before moving down the wall. Roll up and down several times to make sure that you get the paint in all the surface variations. Sometimes it helps to lift the roller and spin it so that the same part of the roller is not always on the same part of the wall surface. Load the roller with paint again and paint the next line in the same way. Overlap the first line by about. This allows any new paint to easily mix with the paint that was previously applied and reduces the chance of roller lines showing up when the paint dries. You always want to apply new paint onto the wet edge of the paint you previously applied. Work your way around the shed and paint all the surfaces. On heavily grooved siding, you may need to use a paintbrush to paint inside the grooves. The 7th step is to paint the shed walls. Work your way around the shed and paint all the surfaces using the same technique used to install the primer. You will typically need to install 2 coats of paint to make sure that you have even coverage. Continue learning about shed building by clicking on one of these videos. Thanks for watching.